Before watching this video, you should already understand and be able to define aerobic capacity and VO2 max, describe and analyse 4 methods of evaluating aerobic capacity, and describe and analyse 2 methods of improving aerobic capacity. So the areas ticked on the specification indicate the sections that we've already covered, and we're moving on today to this area, the use of target heart rates as an intensity guide. Now, just wanted to remind you of a previous slide here when we talked about training to develop aerobic capacity and the importance of both intensity and duration when designing and carrying out those sessions. So this section was about duration, but I wanted to remind you about the importance of intensity. So if training intensity is too low, the training will have limited effect. If training intensity is too high, the individual will be training above the anaerobic threshold, so there will be limited aerobic adaptations. The adaptations will be anaerobic instead. And this is a really important theory to remember for today's lesson. Similarly, I wanted to remind you about VO2 max. So VO2 max is the maximum volume of oxygen inspired, transported and utilised per minute during exhaustive exercise. Remember that exercise intensity and oxygen uptake positively correlate. As exercise intensity increases, so does oxygen uptake up until the point we reach our VO2 max. That point during exhaustive exercise that we cannot inspire, transport or utilise any more oxygen. That's our VO2 max. Now, we can use VO2 max to determine and measure our relative exercise intensity. So if we said on this line, if this is 0 oxygen uptake and this is 100% oxygen uptake, this would be sort of 50%. And so that would tell us that we're working at 50% of our potential exercise intensity. So we can use VO2 max as a guide for exercise intensity. If we were to do that, for example, for a HIIT training session, we would say that the individual should work between 70 and 90% of their VO2 max at that level to reach the desired exercise intensity for a HIIT training session. The problem with that is it's really difficult during exercise to measure and keep track of the volume of oxygen that you are consuming. It would require the individual to wear a mask and be carrying and using apparatus to determine just how much oxygen they are utilising, with a reading giving them that as a percentage of their VO2 max. So what we actually tend to use instead of that is a percentage of our maximum heart rate, rather than using a percentage of our VO2 max to tell us how hard we're working during our session. So we can do this because heart rate and exercise intensity also positively correlate. As relative exercise intensity increases, so does heart rate, and it does so up to our heart rate maximum. Again, just like VO2 max, we reach a point during exhaustive exercise or close to exhaustive exercise where our heart rate cannot increase any further, but up until that point, heart rate increases as exercise intensity does. So we can use percentage of maximum heart rate to measure how hard we are working our exercise intensity during our session. And that's important because dependent on the method that we choose in order to improve our aerobic capacity, they call for different levels of intensity during the exercise session. So continuous training says that the individual should work between 60 and 80% of their heart rate maximum. For high intensity interval training, says that the individual should work between 80 and 95% of their heart rate maximum, and that the recovery should be between 40 and 50% of their heart rate maximum. So we're using this idea of percentage of heart rate max in order to determine how hard we're working and make sure we're A, not working too hard, and B, that we're working hard enough so that we bring about the desired adaptations. Now, there's a really common graph that you often see in gyms on fitness equipment. It's called an exercise target zone chart. Now, there are loads and loads of examples of these. They all look a little bit different. So this one, for example, has got 5 zones with 5 different names. It's got a higher age at the left-hand side of the x-axis and the lower age at the right hand side of the x-axis. So when I'm looking at this chart, I'm immediately thinking about all of those things. So I just have a look at the names: the red line zone, the anaerobic threshold zone, the aerobic zone, the weight management zone, and the healthy heart zone. So just as an example, this particular chart is saying that the aerobic zone, to work within the aerobic zone, an individual must work between 70 and 80% of their maximum heart rate. This is really easy. So a 30-year-old, if they wanted to work in that aerobic zone, would just track the graph up to the bottom of that zone and then across, and then track the graph up to the top of that zone and across, and it gives them their lower and their upper training or target heart rate. So in this example, the lower end of their target heart rate would be about 133 beats per minute, and the upper end of their target heart rate would be about 155 beats per minute for this session. Sometimes it's called a target heart rate, sometimes it's called a working heart rate, sometimes it's called a training heart rate. It's all the same thing. It's essentially the heart rate that we are trying to achieve and maintain during the session in order to stay in the desired zone. Let's have a look at a different chart. So it's the same idea, but it's very different. And this is why it's really important to really take some time in the exam, if you've got one of these, to have a look at what this is showing you. So this time there are 4 zones instead of 5. They're all got different names. The percentages of the heart rate max are different for each zone. And this time the younger age is at the left and the older age is at the right of the x-axis. And that's why the lines slope, the zones slope in the opposite direction. So let's have a go at working a few of these out. So we've got somebody who wants to work in the anaerobic threshold zone. So we'd find that's this top one, the 25. So we track up from 25, and I think we would say that that's about 165 beats per minute to about 195 beats per minute. 165 to 195 beats per minute. That would be the target heart rate for this 25-year-old who wanted to work in the anaerobic threshold zone. Let's look at a 20-year-old who wants to work in the fat burning zone. So the 20 is at the bottom of this chart. So we'd go up and we'd say that the bottom, the lowest they should allow their heart rate to get to is 110 beats per minute. The highest would be 130 beats per minute. So that's their target heart rate for this session as a 20-year-old who wants to remain in that fat burning zone. Let's compare that to a 40-year-old who wants to work in the same zone. So for this 40-year-old, it would be between about 100 and 115, 100 and 115 beats per minute in order for them to stay within that fat burning zone as a 40-year-old. And that highlights a really important concept here, that a younger person working in the same zone will have a higher target heart rate than an older person who is working in that same zone. And that's because an older person has a lower maximum heart rate. Maximum heart rate decreases with age. And of course, all the time here, we're working at a percentage of our maximum heart rate. So if our maximum heart rate is lower, then our working heart rate is going to be lower. So let's have a look at the actual formula, what these charts are actually using in order to determine the working heart rates for the different ages and these different zones. It's called the heart rate maximum method. It's a really simple calculation. Let's have a look at a few together. So let's compare again our 20-year-old and our 40-year-old. The heart rate max method uses this equation. Training heart rate is equal to the desired percentage of the maximum heart rate, where maximum heart rate is equal to 220 minus age. Now this is something that's really important to remember this. It's a well-used rule of thumb to say that an individual's maximum heart rate is equal to 220 minus their age. So let's work through this equation. So we're going to do what's in the brackets first, the heart rate max first. So heart rate max we know to be equal to 220 minus age, which in this case is 20. So that's going to give us a maximum heart rate of 200 beats per minute for this 20-year-old. Compared to the 40-year-old, their heart rate max is going to be 220 minus this time 40, which is equal to 180 beats per minute. So we can see how an older individual has a lower maximum heart rate. Therefore, when we work out percentages of these, the older person is going to have a lower training heart rate. So let's assume both want to work at 65%. So the desired percentage is 65% of their maximum heart rate. So we're going to take that 200 and times it by 65%. And whenever we're timesing by a percentage, we do 0. So 0.65 times 200 is 65% of 200. So that gives us 130 beats per minute. On the other hand, we're still using 65%, 0.65. This time we're timesing by 180 beats per minute to give us 117 beats per minute. So what we've effectively done there is this calculation for the 40-year-old and for the 20-year-old that the graph did already. Okay, now the graph obviously gives a lower and an upper zone, gives a lower and an upper working heart rate. So let's do that for the target heart rate zone, because there we've worked out the lower training heart rate if we wanted to use the target heart rate zone. Let's work out the upper. So the upper end of the target heart rate zone asks the individual to work at up to 85% of their maximum heart rate. So this time we're going to times by 0.85. Maximum heart rate hasn't changed. For this 20-year-old, it's still 200. So the upper limit of the person's heart rate for this session should be 170 beats per minute using this heart rate max method. Similarly, we're going to use, so 85% of 180 equals 153 beats per minute for this individual. So we can see how the 20-year-old with the higher maximum heart rate has a higher working heart rate than the 40-year-old with a lower maximum heart rate, even though they're both working at 65% of their maximum. So this method, it's really good. It's simple, it's easy to use, it's effective, and one of the best things about it is that it does take into consideration a person's age. A 40-year-old is working at a different intensity to a 25-year-old, or working at a different working heart rate to the 25-year-old due to their differing maximum heart rates. But one thing that this maximum heart rate method doesn't take into consideration is fitness levels. So when we're exercising at an intensity that's easy for us, let's say a walking intensity, we're working predominantly aerobically. The harder the exercise gets for us, the more we start to use our anaerobic energy system to produce the energy for that exercise. So once we move from a walk into a jog, into a run, into a sprint, as that exercise intensity increases, the anaerobic system, energy system, starts to be used more and more and more to provide energy for the exercise. And there is a point at which the anaerobic energy system actually becomes the predominant energy system for providing the energy for the activity. And that is called the anaerobic threshold. It's the point at which we start to use our anaerobic energy system rather than our aerobic energy system to sustain the exercise intensity. And it is associated with fatigue. Once we're working over and above this anaerobic threshold, soon we will start to fatigue. Now, this is important because our trained person, in this picture I'm saying this individual's trained, this individual's untrained, our trained individual has a higher anaerobic threshold. That means they can work at a higher intensity while still working aerobically. This individual has a comparatively low anaerobic threshold. In real terms, what does that mean then? So if this individual's working at 65% of, let's say, their VO2 max, in this example, that might be quite close to their anaerobic threshold. On the other hand, this trained individual also working at 65% of their VO2 max, for them, this is far away from their anaerobic threshold. So why is that important? Why does that matter? Why is this anaerobic threshold important when we're thinking about calculating target heart rate zones? Well, the closer you work to your anaerobic threshold, the higher your heart rate. So this individual working at 65% of his VO2 max is working close to his anaerobic threshold, and therefore he will have a high working heart rate. This individual, on the other hand, who's working not close to their anaerobic threshold, will have a low working heart rate. Now, the heart rate maximum method that we've just looked at doesn't do that. If these two individuals are the same age, it says that they have the same working heart rate. But if their anaerobic thresholds are at different levels, if one person is fitter than the other, then actually their working heart rates should be different in order to account for that. And there is a different method, rather than using the heart rate maximum method, that takes that into account. It's called Karvonen's method. So it looks like a slightly more complicated, well, it is a slightly more complicated equation, but I think when we work it through, you will be happy with it. So it uses this heart rate max again, 220 minus age. That's exactly the same as the heart rate max method. But Karvonen's method also takes into account resting heart rate. Resting heart rate is a really good indicator of aerobic fitness. So the higher the resting heart rate, the lower the fitness, aerobic fitness. The lower the resting heart rate, the higher the aerobic fitness. So when we have a lower resting heart rate, when we get a lower number in the equation in here, it's going to give us a lower training heart rate because we're fitter, even though we're aiming to achieve the same desired percentage. Now, I think that sounds quite complicated, but we're going to work through a few examples and I think it will become clear when we do that. Now, if you're looking at this calculation and you feel like you're comfortable in carrying that out, then have a go at working through these three examples. The question is to calculate the upper and lower working heart rates within the aerobic zone or the target heart rate zone. Remember, the target heart rate zone asks an individual to work between 65 and 85% of their maximum. If, however, you're looking at this calculation, you're not sure where you would start, watch me do the first one and then you can pause the video and have a go at the other two. So let's start with our 30-year-old who has a resting heart rate of 50 beats per minute. Again, we're going to start with the information that's within the brackets. My pen's just stopped working. Give me a moment. Where's my pen stopped working? Ah, there we go. Okay, so we're going to take on whatever's within the bracket first. So we're going to work out maximum heart rate minus resting heart rate. Remember, maximum heart rate is the same. Heart rate max is equal to 220 minus age, which for this individual is 30. So 220 minus 30 gives us 190. Then we need to minus their resting heart rate, which in this case is 50, which gives us 140. Now this figure then is what's called heart rate reserve. It's the difference between a person's resting heart rate and their maximum heart rate. Now, the lower the resting heart rate, the bigger the difference. So the lower an individual's resting heart rate, the bigger their heart rate reserve. Fitter people, people with better aerobic capacity and VO2 max have a lower resting heart rate. So people with better aerobic fitness are going to have a bigger number here, a bigger heart rate reserve. So this individual's heart rate reserve is 140. We then can do the rest of the equation. So we're going to times it by our desired percentage. Now we're using the target heart rate zone. Our desired percentages are 65 and 85%. So it's the same as with the maximum heart rate method. We do 0.65. This time we're timesing it by our heart rate reserve, so 140 in both instances. So 0.65 times by 140 is 91. 0.65 times 140, 0.85 sorry, times 140 is 119. Then we need to add on our resting heart rate. So we add the resting heart rate, which is 50. And that gives us 141 beats per minute and 169 beats per minute. So this 30-year-old who has a resting heart rate of 50 beats per minute, wanting to work within the target heart rate zone, would need to keep their heart rate between their target heart rate, would therefore need to stay between 141 and 169 beats per minute during this session if they're using Karvonen's method. Let's have a go at a 50-year-old with a resting heart rate of 70 beats per minute. So we're going to do the max heart rate first, which is equal to 220 minus age, which in this case is 50. 220 minus 50 gives us 170. We're then going to take the resting heart rate from that, so minus 70 to give us 100. So this person's heart rate reserve is 100 beats per minute. Now we're timesing that by 0.65 and 0.85 to give us 65 and 85% of that. So 0.65 times 100 is 65 and 0.85 times 100 is 85. Easy maths. Now we're going to add on our resting heart rate. So add on 70 to both of those, and that gives us 135 and 155. So this person's target heart rate is between 135 and 155 beats per minute for their session using Karvonen's principle. Let's now do a 30-year-old with a resting heart rate of 80 beats per minute to allow us to compare it to the 30-year-old with a resting heart rate of 50 beats per minute. Okay, so heart rate max again is 220 minus age, which is 30, to give us 190. We're then going to minus the resting heart rate, which in this case is 80, which gives us 110 beats per minute. So this person's heart rate reserve is 110 beats per minute. We then need to times it by 0.65 and 0.85 to give us 65 and 85% of that. So 0.65 times 110 is 71. 0.85 times 110 is 93. We then need to remember to add on the resting heart rate. So add on 80, which gives us 151 and 173. So this person's target heart rate is between 151 and 173 beats per minute for this session. Now let's compare it to the fitter 30-year-old. The fitter 30-year-old had a target heart rate of 141 to 169 beats per minute. This less fit individual has a target heart rate of 151 to 173 beats per minute, despite the fact that they're the same age and have the same maximum heart rate. And that's because Karvonen's principle is taking into account this idea that this fitter 30-year-old has a higher aerobic capacity. And therefore, at 65% of their maximum, their heart rate is going to be lower and should be lower during training in order to make sure they stick to 65%. The less fit individual with a higher resting heart rate is going to have a higher training heart rate or working heart rate when they're working at 65% of their maximum, because at 65% of their maximum, they are closer to their anaerobic threshold. So just to sum that up then, when you're not as fit, your heart rate at the same intensity will be higher. So by considering resting heart rate, Karvonen's method gives those who are less fit and therefore have higher resting heart rates, higher target heart rates for the same relative exercise intensity. Many fitness professionals therefore might choose Karvonen's method over the heart rate maximum method when calculating target heart rates for this reason. It's more specific to their clients. It takes into account the client's age, and it also takes into account the client's fitness. Just to add on to that then, as a bit of extra really, we can think about this in terms of VO2 max. So this graph is showing us the VO2 maxes of different individuals, obviously measured in millilitres per kilogram per minute. So we've got our untrained lean adult, that means an adult who has a low percentage of body fat, untrained adults, masters trained runners. A masters athlete is an older athlete, and then a younger trained runner. So by looking at this, we could say that a general trained aerobic capacity might be something like 60 millilitres per kilogram per minute. Now, this trained individual might be able to work at 80% of that before they're starting to reach their anaerobic threshold, and therefore before they're starting to fatigue. Now, 80% of 60, I've already done that maths, is 48 millilitres per kilogram per minute. So this individual is able to their oxygen uptake is 48 millilitres per kilogram per minute before they start to work towards their aerobic capacity. And that means that the trained individual can perform with higher training zones, as they can work at higher percentages of their heart rate max before they start to fatigue. What do I mean by higher training zones? So their training zone might be shifted up so that this target heart rate zone, for example, is higher. It might look more like this, okay? Because for this fitter individual, they're not crossing into their anaerobic threshold zone at 170 beats per minute. They actually need to get to 175 beats per minute before they're actually crossing into their anaerobic threshold zone. So for that reason, the zone might be shifted up for a highly trained athlete. On the other hand, we've got someone maybe who is untrained or perhaps has, let's say they're suffering from coronary heart disease, and so they have a much lower VO2 max. So let's take an untrained athlete and say that their VO2 max might be more like 30 millilitres per kilogram per minute. Now, this untrained athlete can't work at 80% of that before they start to fatigue. They're going to be working at more like 65% of that before they start to fatigue. Now, 65% of 30 is just 19.5 millilitres per kilogram per minute of oxygen before they start to fatigue. So that means that for those with low fitness levels, the training zones might be shifted lower to lower the percentage of maximum heart rate that this individual is working at. And so in this case, we might have the training zone shifted, this time the upper level might be lower because this person starts to cross their anaerobic threshold at just 160 beats per minute. And the bottom of it would also shift down too. So to sum up, why do we use heart rate training zones then in training? So heart rate training zones allow us to track and control exercise intensity and therefore ensure that training intensity is, number one, not too low, meaning that the training would have little effect, and also that it's not too high, meaning that undesirable adaptations take place. Therefore, using heart rate training zones ensures that training brings about the desired adaptations. Training zones are also beneficial because they can be made specific to individuals, so the zone can be shifted down for an untrained individual or someone with health issues such as coronary heart disease, so that they're training at a lower percentage of their heart rate max. The zone can also be shifted up for a highly trained individual so that they can train at a higher percentage of their maximum heart rate. So let's have a look at a question. This is a typical and really quite difficult question in this topic area because, well, let's read it first. So why use the target heart rate zone when working to improve aerobic capacity? So what this question is asking you to do, it not only requires you to know about training zones, you've got to know about aerobic capacity and the target heart rate zone, which you probably would have been shown on the exercise target zone chart. But it is also, now it's asking you to apply that knowledge and actually evaluate why would you use the target heart rate zone if you were trying to improve aerobic capacity. So let's think, if we were trying to improve aerobic capacity, what methods would we be using? Well, we would have chosen either continuous training or high intensity interval training, correct? So we already know if we were using continuous training, we'd be wanting to work between 60 and 80% of our heart rate max during the work. Whereas high intensity interval training, we would be wanting to work between 80 and 95% of our heart rate max during the work, and between 40 and 50% of our heart rate max during the rest. Now, does this fit with the target heart rate zone? Yes, it does. Does any of this fit with the target heart rate zone? No, it doesn't. So why would I use the target heart rate zone when I'm working to improve aerobic capacity? The first thing I would be thinking is because I'm using continuous training. Because the target heart rate zone fits in with the recommendations of continuous training to work between 60 and 80%. Actually, if I were using HIIT training, I wouldn't be using the target heart rate zone at all. I would be working in completely different zones. So let's have a look at some good points for the answer to this question. So the target heart rate zone is the appropriate zone then for continuous training because it allows the person to work at the correct intensity. Because working in this zone allows the participant to work for extended periods for more than 20 minutes with no rest, which is what continuous training asks us to do. Training in this way can cause, training in this way causes the aerobic adaptations that we're looking for if we're looking to improve aerobic capacity. If an individual were to work above the target heart rate zone, then they probably wouldn't be able to keep that up for 20 minutes or more. And they'd be working, therefore, above their anaerobic threshold, and that would be causing anaerobic adaptations rather than the aerobic adaptations that we're looking for. If an individual were to work below the target heart rate zone, then there would be little or no impact on aerobic capacity. So just to sum up this whole area of the use of target heart rates as an intensity guide then. So we use target heart rates to ensure that we're working at the correct intensity for the chosen training method. We can do this because as exercise intensity increases, heart rate increases. So heart rate is a good indicator of exercise intensity. We use heart rate training zones to give an upper and lower target heart rate for training that will allow the desired adaptations to take place. This ensures that training intensity will not be too high or too low. We can use both the heart rate max method and Karvonen's method to calculate an individual's target heart rate. The desired exercise intensity is used to do this. So, for example, we've often used 65% in this video. The desired exercise intensity to increase aerobic capacity is different depending on which method of training you use. So remember, continuous training calls for certain intensities, high intensity interval training calls for other intensities. Target heart rate zones can be moved up for highly trained individuals to allow them to work at higher percentages of their heart rate maximum. They can be moved down for untrained individuals or those who have health issues so that they can work at a lower percentage of their heart rate maximum. Okay, so that now means that in terms of the specification, we are here, and we'll be moving on to factors affecting aerobic capacity in this topic area next.